Every week I look out at this audience and I'm reminded how fortunate we are to live in a community that values curiosity, thoughtful discussion, and the chance to engage with some of the world's leading thinkers. So, now to tonight's speaker. Michael Weiss is an investigative journalist, author, and one of the leading experts on Russia, authoritarianism, and international security. He is the editor-at-large of The Insider, an investigative news outlet known for exposing Russian intelligence operations, and has spent years reporting on the Kremlin, disinformation campaigns, espionage, and armed conflict. He is the co-author of ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror, and his reporting has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Daily Beast, and many, many others. Over the years, his investigative work has uncovered Russian covert operations, influence campaigns, and intelligence activities that often sound more like spy novels than real life, except they are very real. Yesterday evening, a small group of us had the chance to hear a preview of tonight's talk, and I can honestly say you're in for a fascinating event, so I'm glad you're all here. Michael has an incredible ability to take these complicated intelligence operations and explain them in an accessible, understandable way that really gets you to the edge of your seat. Tonight, he'll be speaking about the marketization of Russian intelligence. Rather than viewing Russian espionage as a collection of government agencies acting alone, Michael argues that today's intelligence ecosystem increasingly functions like a marketplace, where spies, oligarchs, organized crime, private military companies, hackers, propagandists, and commercial actors all intersect in ways that make Russia's operations more flexible, harder to trace, and often more dangerous. It's a timely topic that sheds light not only on how Russia operates abroad, but also on the evolving nature of intelligence and conflict in the 21st century. So please join me in giving a warm Crested Butte welcome to Michael Weiss.
Thank you very much for that introduction. You'll have to bear with me here. I'm toggling slides and also speaking from a prepared text. So I just want to make sure. I'm not an IT specialist, even though I track and expose some of them working for bad people. So as Taylor was saying, the argument tonight is that what you think you know about Russian intelligence from movies or Cold War thrillers, or indeed, just the history of the Soviet intelligence has changed dramatically. And it's changed dramatically in several respects, and particularly in the last few years. And that change has accelerated since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. When we look at spy operations or disinformation campaigns or influence operations at The Insider, we often are astounded, actually, and it takes a lot to astound us at this point, by just how amateur and unlikely the actors are in these situations. And what has happened is, this is the result of failure. This is the result of incompetence. This is the result of bad tradecraft. The Kremlin has a stated objective in the past. An intelligence service is tasked with advancing that objective. Spy masters would order an operation. Officers and agents in the field would execute using state resources with a clearly defined chain of command. Failures were then absorbed, units reshuffled, but the machine ground on. What we're seeing today is what we call the marketization of Russian intelligence. Units now compete for Kremlin favor by demonstrating results. So you have private billionaires who finance assassination infrastructure as a cost of doing business with the Russian state. You have freelance hackers who are recruited at university hackathons and put on monthly salaries. You have corporate shells, arm manufacturers, wastewater companies, fake news websites which provide cover, funding, and legal distance from the Russian government. This architecture is born of the remnants of the old. It's more chaotic and competitive, and therefore prone to greater danger to the West, because it incentivized more risk-taking, using expendability and plausible deniability as its main virtues. On foreign battlefields, I'm sure people have all heard of the Wagner Group, a private military company or mercenary corps, which assume much of this responsibility in conventional combat. We've seen them deployed in Ukraine, Syria, Mali, Libya, the Central African Republic, under the fig leaf of being a private military company. But in reality, they were a semi-autonomous GRU, or Russian military intelligence proxy, financed and headed by a now deceased former Russian catering magnate called Yevgeny Prigozhin. But in the last decade, we've seen how professional spies get caught and unmasked using the conventional or the old structures. So assassins who travel on fake passports all over the world, particularly to Europe, these passports were issued in a staggering display of incompetence in sequential batches. So for instance, if I have a fake identity and I'm going to be called Ivan Serov, and they issue me a passport for the sake of argument, number 1, everyone in my team gets a passport, and it's number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. It's like Spaceballs, you know, the combination on your luggage. This has made black ops teams much easier to trace, and indeed, one of the tools that we have used at The Insider is we are able to map travel patterns and to identify members of the same black ops unit based on the fake passport sequences that they were issued. What else do we know about conventional Russian espionage? And this is something that is frankly time-tested and is a holdover from the Soviet period. They steal service funds to keep their mistresses in luxury hotels or to throw lavish weddings for their children, or to drive around Moscow in cars worth several times their on-paper salaries. They leave burner accounts open on unprotected servers featuring documentary evidence about terrorist attacks committed decades or years ago. So my colleagues and I exploit these weaknesses, identifying dozens of GRU officers by true name, by their passport, and by the passport number. And the new model that has emerged, and this has emerged only, I would say, in the last half-decade, born of these failures, and now also of the exigencies of a heavily sanctioned wartime economy and an internationally isolated Russia, the new model is designed to curry favor with Putin. What does Putin want? What does he insist? All of society must now contribute to the defense of the motherland. It is couched in the language of patriotism, similar to World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, wherein Russia is seen not to be fighting just this surprisingly formidable and resilient entity and army called Ukraine, but all of NATO simultaneously, with the United States, the main adversary, at the helm. So new spy units are popping up, some of them akin to small armies, drawing for their rank and file active or former members of the security services, particularly the GRU and the FSB, which is the successor to the Soviet KGB. So this is more or less in tandem to with what I'm saying. And they work at their own initiatives. They greenlight murder, they greenlight kidnapping, they greenlight provocations or kinetic attacks against foreign targets. Now, in lieu of dispatching trained professionals, people who were recruited from the military and given years of training into how to assemble incendiary devices or conduct diversionary tactics or sabotage operations, now we see amateurs and hirelings who were recruited off the internet and compensated for as little as a few €100 to go throw a petrol bomb into a window or to daub a piece of graffiti on the wall of a government or NATO installation. In some cases, billionaire oligarchs foot the bill for covert action as a kind of tithe or tribute to the Kremlin for being allowed to enrich themselves for so many years, spending their fortunes in the West. Indeed, I mean, those who spent their fortunes in the West buying chateaus and chalets, British football clubs, British newspapers, now are being asked to spend their fortunes to attack and destabilize the West. You'll have seen this, I'm sure, the assassination, attempted assassination of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury, England in 2018. This was a conventional GRU Black Ops unit known as Unit 29155. And you see there the two assassins or poisoners who we identified at The Insider by their true name, and indeed prove were connected to the Russian security services. They traveled in the passports that I mentioned with the same sequence. So these guys now have been rolled up. Every member of Unit 29155 is known to every Western counterintelligence and law enforcement agency, thanks in part to the work that we're doing, but also in part to the work that counterintelligence has already done. Their biometric data is stored in every border guard service. They cannot travel to the West to blow things up or to kill people. But I want to explain a little bit about the backstory of this organization and how long they have been in operation, because it is staggering to see what they've got away with. So I mentioned the Skripal assassination attempt using a military-grade nerve agent called Novichok. These guys also attempted to poison a Bulgarian arms dealer named Emilian Gebrev and his family years before the Skripal assassination attempt. And that poisoning was not pieced together until after Skripal and after we identified members of this unit. The same unit has contributed to and carried out the destruction of a series of weapons and ammunition depots across NATO and EU territory, including in Bulgaria and the Czech Republic. They've mounted an attempted coup d'etat in Montenegro on the eve of that country's accession to NATO. And as we now know, and I'll get into a little bit later, they were sort of the pioneers of a sprawling campaign of cyber operations, disinformation, and sabotage, what's known as hybrid warfare, across Europe and in Ukraine. Indeed, Ukraine was the laboratory or the petri dish where they really refined their efforts. So for years, this unit operated in the shadows. Then we started to identify members of the unit, and through identification of a few, we were able to anatomize the entirety of Unit 29155. The problem that these guys also faced, as I mentioned, is staggering levels of corruption, right? They enrich themselves to a degree that even people in Russia who find corruption to be just a price of doing business were sort of astounded by. So what's happened now? I'm going to explain to you 4 case studies of what we've been identifying in the last year or two, again, alluding to what we call the marketization of Russian intelligence. So, number 1, inside the GRU's the hacker unit within the GRU kill squad. So, Unit 29155, their operatives might not be able to travel internationally anymore, but the unit still exists. And what we didn't realize until very recently was that they were implicated in a state hacking campaign in the United States in August of 2024. We revealed this investigation in May of 2025. The story was pieced together using leaked emails, social media posts, phone records, unprotected server logs, and abandoned burner accounts on vKontakte, which is like Russian Facebook, and on Twitter. The funny thing about this unit is the guy who headed it is not a professional Russian intelligence operative. He was a blogger. Okay, his name is Timur Stigal. He was known as a hacker by the hacker alias Key, an ethnic Chechen living in Dagestan, spent years trying to prove his loyalty to Moscow. In 2011, he made a name for himself by accusing a Kremlin insider of corruption on Twitter, something you typically don't do if you're going to go on to a storied career in Russian intelligence. By 2012, he founded a local chapter of Nashi, which is the Kremlin's pro-youth movement. He organized a campaign to rename a center square in Makhachkala Putin Square. And these efforts were eventually rewarded. By June of 2014, Stigal had been recruited formally into Unit 29155 and issued a cover identity. 3 years later, he was traveling internationally using the same batch of fake passports that I mentioned. What he built inside the unit, though, wasn't a conventional military cyber unit. It was something more ad hoc, improvisational, more criminal, and in some ways more effective for those reasons. He found a small team of freelance hackers, some of them ex-convicts, some of them recruited from the FSB's own network of criminal informants, and paid to run false flag operations, hack and leak campaigns, and disinformation operations across Europe, the Middle East, and the former Soviet space. Among his greatest hits, one has never been publicly divulged until our investigation. In May of 2016, his team penetrated QNB, Qatar's largest state bank. They exfiltrated 1.5 gigabytes of data, and they released this data dump online, and it was structured designed to draw attention to the financial dealings of the Qatari royal family and their government's intelligence operations. Doha was then, at the time, financially and militarily backing Syrian rebel groups opposed to Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, which the Russian government was actively defending, including with direct military intervention. Responsibility for this hack was claimed by a fake Twitter account purporting to be a Turkish far-right hacking group, but that account was run by Timur Stigal himself. So this false flag approach was a signature of the unit's work. A day before the NATO summit in Warsaw in July of 2016, at which Ukraine's future in the transatlantic alliance was on the agenda, Stygal's team hacked Polish telecom company data under the name of Ukraine's ultranationalist right sector movement. Right sector is quite controversial, particularly to the Russians, because they, as I say, they have an ultranationalist orientation, and was one of the pretexts for Putin to launch his invasion of Ukraine. And this fake false flag operation accused Poland of eyeing to annex pieces of Western Ukraine. Believe it or not, there was a point at which, after 2014, where Putin had actually suggested to Warsaw, why don't we divvy up this country, Ukraine? You take the western half and I'll take the eastern half. And the Polish government said, thanks, but no thanks. To this hack, the Polish government officials reacted in anger. But the attribution was entirely fabricated. But what did this end up doing? It drove a wedge between Warsaw, a country that at the time was supporting Ukraine's military and its security services, and the Ukrainian government, which was trying to incorporate some of these more outre or controversial groups into the conventional order of battle. And we see this playing out now, by the way, in terms of relitigating the history of the 20th century. There's a divide now between Polish nationalists and the Ukrainian government, which the Russians are all too happy to exploit. According to a Polish security official who we spoke with, this case was handled at the lowest possible level at the prosecutor's office, and it went nowhere. But the same false flag infrastructure was then turned against Bellingcat, which is one of the other organizations, an online investigative platform that has helped uncover some and unmask these Russian spy operations. Stygal's team basically stole Lithuanian bank data, falsely attributed a hack to Bellingcat. Again, the investigators were being accused of being the culprits themselves, and then doxed the names and photographs of children of Ukrainian soldiers serving on the front lines in Donbass. The unit drew up a targeting list of Bellingcat employees and associates, misspelled the organization as Billingcat, which is a common Russian misspelling for Bellingcat. And several people on the list confirmed to the insider that they were targeted. These are, again, children or Ukrainian officials, targeted by spear phishing campaigns, right? So Stygal's important asset was a Bulgarian journalist, Dilana Gayetiseva, who had once been celebrated for her investigative reporting. Now, this is the point in the conversation where I always like to emphasize that Russian spycraft is not like Hollywood cinema. Everything you've learned from the James Bond franchise, put out of your mind, no fast cars, no glamour. Unfortunately, I have to show you this next slide of Dilana in all of her glory on social media. So it's not always the case that things are a little too boring and prosaic, but anyway, this is our hero. Chats uncovered by the insider shows Stygal cultivating her over an extended period of time, feeding her hacked data sets, and directing her reporting. She published a story based on data hacked by Stygal's team from the Azerbaijani embassy in Sofia, Bulgaria, presenting this as a totally above-board journalistic investigation, and it was about Western arms trafficking into various terrorist groups. And the Russians love to say that NATO is arming Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so on. We have messages from Stygal showing him simultaneously trying to prod an Armenian foreign ministry official into lodging a diplomatic protest with the Bulgarian ambassador in Yerevan and pushing for a protest in front of the Azerbaijani embassy in Sofia. But Dilana was the on-the-ground organizer of this whole campaign. So she was acting, quote-unquote, as a journalist, but really as an asset of Russian military intelligence, then turned into this instrument of agitprop in foreign European territory. She eventually sets up her own website, armswatch.com, a dedicated platform for publishing hack and leak products courtesy of Tim and his organization. Whether by accident or design, the aesthetic mirrored that of Bellingcat, so there's a kind of projection of envy, I think, in terms of the work that my colleagues have been able to do. The best part is she put on the website, I am an independent journalist and do not work for governments or corporations, which of course is not true. But here's a story that you all will have heard that we can attribute to Dilana and to Unit 29155. I'm sure some of you have heard that one of the things that Ukraine was developing in the lead up to the full-scale invasion, biolabs that were experimenting or weaponizing deadly viruses, including possibly the COVID pandemic virus. This came from Unit 29155. Timur Stygal, again, a blogger turned hacker, recruited into Russian intelligence, invented this conspiracy theory. We have chats between him and other members of his team, which are using this conspiracy theory to justify getting tens of millions of dollars in additional state funding. The the falsehoods that are contained in this conspiracy theory became a bedrock of official Russian government claims about American bioweapon research, repeated by General Igor Kirillov. He was formerly the head of Russia's radiological and chemical weapons unit. He was assassinated by Ukrainian intelligence in Moscow a few years ago. But to show you the impact that this kind of thing has, everything that was done by this Bulgarian fake journalist and the hacking team behind her wound up being mouthed by Tulsi Gabbard in advance of her becoming the director of national intelligence under the second Trump administration. And she mentioned the Ukraine biolabs conspiracy theory in an interview with Tucker Carlson in March of 2024. Then she goes on to become DNI. On her way out the door last month, she published, quote, classified intelligence on the US side, claiming to stand up this conspiracy theory, again, invented entirely by Russian military intelligence and their assets in Europe, when in fact everything that she published shows from US intelligence that this is a complete hoax, this is a conspiracy theory designed by the Russians to divide and so influence in the United States to weaken our resolve and resiliency when it comes to supporting Ukraine. So we have, at the very high level of American intelligence, somebody who's being spoon-fed a Russian disinformation product and just gobbling it up whole, okay? Stigall and his team, beginning in 2019, start to recruit new people. His supervisor, a man called Roman Puntis, travels to southwest Russia to scout talent at a university, capture the flag hackathon. Let me go back one slide. This is recruiting young coders, referred to affectionately as eaglets by the team. The first one they recruited was a Moldovan IT student, Vitaly Shevchenko. He was hired from the military Air Force in Voronezh in early 2020, earned a salary of 400,000 rubles, or just over $5,000 a month, a high wage by Russian standards. His first assignment was penetrating the Estonian Ministry of Defense and other Estonian government institutions, a leak later attributed to 29155 in a very rare Estonian indictment. But the pre-invasion campaign of Ukraine, remember, Ukraine has been the laboratory or the petri dish, or you might even call it the Rosetta Stone for understanding a lot of Russian malign activity, was what Stigall and his team were doing in advance of Russian tanks crossing the border in February of 2022. So we have subfolders of work that they were doing, which we've uncovered. They refer to things like bacteriological laboratories, graffiti in cities, work with Nazis, target among Ukrainian authorities. Graffiti folder alone contains geolocated proof of delivery photographs and chat records with dozens of recruited assets across Ukraine, where they were doing what? They were spray painting anti-Zelensky slogans on buildings. They threw petrol bombs through the window of a government minister. They were being paid in cryptocurrency, hundreds of thousands of dollars dispersed over the time, the period from 2019 up until 2022. So again, we see them kind of seeding the terrain for a full-scale invasion by trying to demoralize the Ukrainian population and indeed recruit assets in the country as a kind of fifth column to stand up a Russian occupation. So Puntis, Stigall's boss, combines his management of this cyber operation with a very active and apparently very unsupervised personal life. Here's where things get a little fun and interesting. So his work phone is registered under a cover identity, appears in the contact lists of more than 7 VIP escorts in Moscow, which we've managed to identify. He's conducting a years-long affair with a woman in Rostov, to whom he funnels GRU funds through a shell company she nominally controls. She gives birth to his son. He's married, by the way, so this is his second family. Gives birth to his son in November 2023. The shell company, called Aegean Impulse, also manufactures military drones for the Russian army, which are now being used in Ukraine. The server in Rostov was left dormant and unprotected and unsecured. In 2025, hacktivists discovered it, retraced 29155's activities to 2021, and leaked this material to us. So here you have an example of guys doing something they should not do, talking to people, recruiting, in some cases sleeping with people who are not trained for this kind of work, using state resources to finance their own side action, but then leaving everything out there on the internet to be found by enterprising hackers and investigators. And through that, we've been able to piece together one of the most ambitious hybrid warfare campaigns in Europe prior to the full-scale invasion. Now, these campaigns are now turning, as you can imagine, into a very brisk business, and I'll get into that in a second. I want to talk about another operation that we have anatomized. And this comes back to the acts of state terrorism or sabotage throughout Europe now. So the GRU has managed to reactivate old networks in Europe, particularly among former Soviet states. And we've known about this for a long time. A few years ago, they recruited organized crime riffraff in Estonia to go around smashing the windows of cars belonging to Estonian government ministers. We didn't realize, though, they're also reactivating former Soviet military officials. So here's a story. In the early summer of 2024, a guy called Nikolai Zagorodny called Andrei Baburov. Both men lived in St. Petersburg. Both had served for decades as Soviet naval officers in the Northern Fleet, alongside another guy called Alexander Mironishkov, a former commander of a nuclear submarine, and Alexander Katzer, a one-time submarine helmsman. So here you have a military unit, long dormant from the Cold War period, but everybody keeps in touch, right? Baburov is now running a logistics company called Baltic Escort for several months, offering services to circumvent Western sanctions on Russia. So clearly his heart is with Moscow. Zagorodny explains that the submarine commander, now ill with cancer, terminal cancer, by the way, needs help. There's a package in Riga intended for his relatives, which needs to be picked up and forwarded to Vilnius, where the relatives said they would collect it. Contents of the package, several kilograms of it, were said to be medicine or neck massage pillows. And everyone's answer was, well, when the commander instructs us to do something, we just oblige. This request set off a near month-long relay of parcels routed through 3 Baltic countries, Poland, Germany, the United Kingdom, with a detour in Moldova, a courier network run through Telegram, social media application popular among Russians, by a handler, or the instructions given to them by a handler using the alias Yarek Jepa. Baburov called an old friend in Latvia, an electronics trader, horse breeder, and merchant marine whose son Baburov had baptized as a godfather, so again, complex family dynamics. And basically, they decided to construct a bomb, an incendiary device, drive it to Vilnius, and from there, it passes through a wide range of couriers and is handed off to sub-agents recruited from this network. Okay? Nobody knows who they're handing things off to. There's, again, these walls of separation and plausible deniability. One of the guys is a Ukrainian ex-convict living in Warsaw who rents a Vilnius Airbnb under a fake name, splits the shipment into 4 parcels, hides the incendiary devices inside neck massage pillows, cosmetic tubes, and sex toys. A Lithuanian fraudster who serves as the company's president and was responsible for one of Poland's largest pyramid schemes, which was in fact run by Russians who stole 700 million euros. He gets lost trying to find the safe house. Again, these are amateurs. They don't have intelligence experience. So then what does he do? A money launderer that's recruited off this Telegram channel with a nickname V-Warrior explains to him crossing the borders of all Baltic states, and he must now cross the border of all 3 Baltic states and Poland, which he does 5 times, before finally placing the bombs, guess where? On 2 commercial cargo planes, DHL and DPD, in depots using fake identities. So on July 20th, 2024, the first bomb explodes inside a DHL cargo container in Leipzig, in Germany, the hub through which the company processes about 2,500 tons of their packages. And that's before it could be loaded into the hold of a plane. Now imagine for a second if the bomb had not detonated prematurely, but had been loaded in the plane and then blew up somewhere between Germany and it was destined for the UK. So that explosion, that's debris falling down upon thousands of innocent civilians in Europe, right? It could have been worse than the MH17 disaster, which the Russians were also responsible for. Germany's domestic intelligence chief later said it was just a happy coincidence that the bomb went off on the tarmac. Now, a second fire occurred the next day at a DPD depot near Warsaw, completely different country, completely different city, also NATO and EU member. A third bomb detonated at a DHL warehouse in Birmingham, in the UK. And a 4th bomb was intercepted by Polish security services before it could go off. Right? So 4 different bombs, 3 of them go off. Fortunately, nobody gets hurt, but the 3rd one, counterintelligence manages to catch. So it turns out the handler running this Telegram account was identified as Yaroslav Mikhailov, a 37-year-old Russian wanted by the FSB, his own country's domestic security services, for what? Smuggling weapons, explosives, and radioactive material. He was arrested in 2022, sentenced, but never imprisoned. which is usually a sign that he was recruited, because the Russian services love to, as I've been describing, love to rely on riffraff and organized criminal elements. His cutouts, though, were not limited to these parcel bombings. The same infrastructure was used to direct an arson in May of 2024 that destroyed over 1,300 shops in a Warsaw shopping center, and a second arson at an IKEA store in Vilnius. Both were carried out by a 17-year-old Ukrainian refugee, Daniil Bardedum, who was retained en route while he was planning a third attack in Latvia, carrying explosives built from the same formula, the same compound he had received from one of the parcel operations prior. Investigators have also linked this network to a suspected arson at a shopping mall in Lodz, Poland, and to a separate scheme laundering cryptocurrency and text message fraud. So V-Warrior, as it turns out, the fake name used by the Telegram handler, is connected to the GRU, and it's connected to the new incarnation of Unit 155, known as the Department of Special Tasks. Special tasks in the Russian lexicon refers to acts of assassination and sabotage and other kinetic things, or wet work, as they like to call it. And this is a very evocative name, Department of Special Tasks. In the Soviet period, there was a KGB department of the same name. They were responsible for eliminating enemies of the USSR, most famously Leon Trotsky, who one of their agents impaled his head with an ice axe in Mexico in 1940. They went after Ukrainian nationalists and so on. So what we see here now is the reconstitution of old tradecraft, I've gone through all of this. This map, though, is very handy to show you just how expansive this network was, where these parcels, where these bombs bypassed all these different countries, right? So again, the potential for collateral damage here, they didn't have to go off prematurely once they reached the destination of DHL and DPD. They could have gone off at any point, killing loads of civilians. Because again, amateurs are the ones responsible for this. But anyway, we see now a kind of recrudescence of really risk-friendly, reckless, and murderous activities by the Russian security services in the very name itself. They're going to go travel the world eliminating enemies. And some of those enemies are not going to be defectors from their security services or so-called traitors like Alexei Navalny or the Skripals. They're going to be Western targets. And what makes this case instructive is not its sophistication, but rather the opposite. A cancer-stricken Soviet submarine commander who could barely walk, using a godfather favor, relatives who never came for a package, guys who got lost, couldn't find a safe house. You know, it is amateur hour, but amateur hour financed at an almost limitless degree with, behind these cutouts, these kind of Matryoshka doll structures, trained officers of Russian military intelligence who never have to leave Moscow or St. Petersburg. They're doing this online. I mean, this tradecraft is very similar to what I used to study covering Al-Qaeda and ISIS. When their so-called caliphate was destroyed in Syria and Iraq, what did ISIS do? They went and they used Telegram to try and recruit what they called lone wolf jihadis online. They didn't have to pay these guys because there was an ideological zealotry at play here. The other thing to understand is the Russians love to recruit Ukrainians, down on their luck Ukrainians, refugees looking for easy pay. Why? Well, if the Ukrainians blow themselves up, great, that's one less Ukrainian to deal with. If they carry off their mission successfully, all of us here think, well, gee, maybe we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine so much because the Ukrainians are now terrorists running around Europe setting things off and killing people, right? So they like to basically attribute to their adversary that which they themselves are guilty of. Now, there's a third case study. This is one of my favorites. And it's one of my favorites because everything I've been describing so far, rooted in failure, in incompetence, in jaw-dropping stupidity by trained Russian intelligence operatives, and indeed, I mean, amateurs. There was an attempt at one point, very recent, to get rid of all of this, sort of nonsense, to air gap a special Russian security service cutout, a hit squad that really doubled as a private army. So on the night of February 23, 2026, which is Defender of the Fatherland Day in Russian military culture, a revered day, a man called Denis Alimov checked into an airport in Moscow, apparently on his way to a beach holiday in Cartagena. He was carrying a freshly issued passport under a fake identity. The next morning, he lands at El Dorado International Airport in Bogota, Colombia. Within minutes of clearing the arrivals hall, Colombian migration officers had him in cuffs. An Interpol red notice activated at the request of federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, I'll wait for that follow-up, had been waiting at the gate. So Alimov was not a tourist. He was a senior operative of something called Center 795. Now, this is Russia's newest and most secretive assassination directorate, or it was until our investigation dropped. Its existence had only surfaced in Russia months earlier through a wrongful termination suit in a military court outside of Moscow, but its leadership, sponsor, structure, location, all of these things were unknown until very recently. Center 795 was established by a Russian General Staff order in December of 2022, so again, less than a year into the invasion of Ukraine. It was given a military designation, Unit 75127, but the internal colloquial name 795. It was designed in response, as I mentioned, to the failures of Unit 29155, and it was designed, and here's the interesting thing, by people who were rivals or competitors to that unit's founding commander, Andrei Avrianov. What the old unit needed, Moscow decided, was not rehabilitation, but a little healthy competition and rivalry. You know, it's like Steve Jobs turning Apple technicians or coders against each other to develop the best possible product. Except in this case, the product is murder or kidnapping or sabotage. So in its architecture, it was kind of ingenious how they did this. Rather than sitting within the GRU's existing bureaucratic structure, Center 795 was embedded inside the Kalashnikov concern, a storied arms manufacturing company. Its officers were listed as on the payroll of the Kalashnikov company. Their operational base was the Patriot Park military-industrial complex just outside Moscow, where the Kalashnikov maintains an administrative building. Training activities were camouflaged as test shooting. I mean, Kalashnikov makes rifles, right? So it's not uncommon to hear guns being fired. But this was actually them training up to do wet work abroad. The backer of Center 795 is a guy called Andrei Bokarev, a billionaire arms dealer who has the controlling ownership of Transmash Holding, one of Russia's largest rail and defense conglomerates. He maintains a deep connection to Kalashnikov through financial arrangements that survived his ostensible divestment because of sanctions pressure in 2018 as a result of the first invasion of Ukraine. The financing model is very similar to Prigozhin's Wagner Group. Private wealth channeled through state contracts, clandestine military capacity that serves the Kremlin interests while maintaining a legal distance and a kind of bureaucratic fiction showing that there's no real connection to the Russian government, when of course that's not the case. So they drew for their staff 500 officers from FSB's elite Alpha and Wimpel Special Forces unit. Alpha and Wimpel were responsible, by the way, for the invasion of Afghanistan in 1975 and assassinating the Afghan president. That's this kind of unit. The structure was presented in PowerPoint presentation, which we obtained, and it's similar to like a corporate boardroom slideshow. Infographics, org charts, icons of tanks and drones. We've obtained this, Western Intelligence have obtained this. It fielded 3 different directorates: an intelligence directorate, which runs human agents abroad, conducts open source intelligence, signals intercepts, drone reconnaissance, physical pre-strike surveillance. Its sniper department sits within the intelligence directorate, which is rather telling in itself because that suggests that they're going to be using guns to go out and do assassinations, right? And that's exactly what they were trying to do. I won't bore you with too many of the other details here, but the Combat Support Directorate, let me give you a sense of just the scale of this thing, includes armor and artillery, including T-90A main battle tanks, the most advanced tanks that the Russians have fielded in Ukraine, Smersh multiple launch rocket systems, air defense systems, and medical units. This is an army in a box, basically, well beyond the capabilities of what 29155 had done. The leadership is also kind of hybridized. A guy called Denis Fisenko is the commander. He's the 3-time recipient of the Order of Courage. He's a champion in combat weapons shooting, and he's the author of an FSB Special Operations Training Regiment. So the salaries in the unit reflect the ambition. Department heads earn about $7,800 a month. Fisenko himself received close to $40,000 a month, or $500,000 a year. This is unprecedented. This is unheard of if you're a Russian spy. Now, Alimov, the guy who I mentioned earlier who got nabbed in Bogota, he had served in the Alpha unit of the FSB before joining Center 795 in 2023. He maintained a personal relationship with the Chechen warlord President Ramzan Kadyrov, and this is important. By the end of 2024, his focus had shifted as an intelligence officer to targeting Chechen dissidents throughout Europe, specifically members of the Zakayev family. So the patriarch of the Zakayev family is a man called Ahmed Zakayev. I've known him in London for many years. He is the acting prime minister in exile of the unrecognized Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, which they were opposed to what Putin was doing, obviously, in the Chechen wars, and now Kadyrov has been slotted in as the head of Chechnya. So to execute operations in the West, federal prosecutors have alleged, Alimov had to recruit a sub-agent, a local operative, a Serbo-Croatian speaker living in the United States. This man's name was Darko Durovkic. His precise background remains confidential under seal in the New York Southern District. In October 2024, Alimov meets Durovic in Moscow at a restaurant near the FSB's Lubyanka headquarters, gives him $60,000 as a down payment. Promised payout for each target successfully killed or legally deported to Russia, which is kidnapping, $1.5 million. A lot of money for a Serb-Croat guy living in the US. If the operation succeeds and further targets are identified, Alimov told him, a third individual, dead or alive, could yield a bounty in excess of $10 million. So Center 795, again, designed to be impenetrable. It's electronics, it's signals, it's communications, unhackable, unreadable by Western counterintelligence. They've been taking every precaution, encrypted messaging, pseudonyms, compartmentalized communications. What they hadn't anticipated, though, is that if a Russian guy who doesn't speak Serbo-Croat recruits a Serbo-Croat sub-agent, they don't speak the same language, they're going to have to use a translation app or an intermediary to translate. So the smart way to do this was to find a native speaker of Serbian, right, to communicate. Instead, Alimov, again, FSB Alpha, decided to use Google Translate. Now, what is the problem with using Google Translate? Well, it's true if you're using encrypted, end-to-end encrypted software, particularly if it's Russian-made, nobody's going to read that. But Google servers happen to be located in California. They fall within the reach of an FBI surveillance warrant. And so armed with a court order, investigators access logs of these translations directly from Google, showing Alimov tasking his agent to go out and commit murder, including against targets in the United States who have yet to be identified. So one source in Western law enforcement said this was even better than us doing wiretaps because we have to sit there and transcribe things. This came pre-transcribed. We just downloaded their communication. So in one exchange, Durovkic, the sub-agent, reports from Montenegro he can't confirm the location of a target in New York, where I live, because he's out of the country. In another, he says that he describes a suspect villa with an Islamic symbol on the gate, again, in a European port of call. On Christmas Eve 2024, he messages an unnamed co-conspirator in the US, quote, I have people who would pay a lot of money to have this person and others like him arrested and handed over to them. For each person, we'd get 1.5 million US. He also uses search engines to research firearms, Glock 17, Glock 21, Glock 22. These are common assassination pistols, right? Where to obtain them in Montenegro. Now, he's arrested in March 2025. Alimov, unaware of the extent that the FBI has basically received everything, all of their comms, is there waiting for him in Bogota on what turns out to be his first and last trip abroad under a cover identity. So a near-perfect illustration of a recurring pattern. Russia's most secret military unit, government in a box almost, with its private army, air defense systems, tanks, not undone by a defector or mole or even a bad passport sequence number, but a language barrier and Google servers and a warrant, right? This is meant to be undetectable, but now there's going to be new 795s. Now the final case study I have for you, which we published very recently, this kind of goes over what I just described. Bauman University's Department 4. In-house at the Insider, we call this the GRU's Hogwarts Academy. And why do we do that? Bauman Moscow State University is the equivalent of MIT in Russia. It's an enrollment of 30,000, internationally renowned for computer science engineering. It's located about 4 kilometers from Red Square. Its motto, courage, will, work, persistence. Very applicable model to what I'm about to describe to you. Nestled inside Bauman's transparent degrees program, and you can go to Bauman and just become a computer scientist, you're not a spy and you don't work for the government, is a secret faculty with deliberately meaningless names. Department 4, also known as Special Training. This is where the GRU trains its next generation of hackers and saboteurs and information warfare specialists using a curriculum that draws directly from the GRU's own operational experience, including its experience in Ukraine. So we were able, with our consortium partners such as Der Spiegel and Le Monde, we obtained 2,000 documents from Department 4 covering the years 2022 to 2024. So again, the start of the war and up until very recently. Curricula, contracts, propaganda, presentations, photos from the classes. Best of all, a list of students, graduates, and lecturers. So basically the HR directory of the coming generation of GRU information warfare specialists and hackers. That's exactly what a Western intelligence official said to us. It's like you've got the yearbook directory for new spies. The spy school is divided into 3 military specializations. One is called the Special Service for Intelligence. This is where undergraduates are taught information warfare, electronic reconnaissance, and what the curriculum calls IT-related special competencies. They love to use very vague and seemingly anodyne language for very nasty things, the Russians. The GRU directly shapes this curriculum, defining qualification requirements, approving the candidates, signing off on expenses, and so on. One course titled Defense Against Technical Reconnaissance teaches 144 hours in 2 semesters, the complete modern toolkit of offensive hacking. How to spearfish, how to exploit known IT vulnerabilities, Trojan horse viruses, penetrating testing exercise. Module 6, dedicated entirely to computer viruses. Final assignment, guess what it is? Design your own bespoke piece of malware that can shut down computer terminals or indeed, cripple international shipping companies, hospital servers, you name it. The tools and techniques for waging distributed denial of service attacks when you take down a website or you shut down a digital network are also part of this curriculum. Another group seminar, mandatory for all advanced students, developing a propaganda campaign. Now this gets interesting too. The task described is, quote, create a social video for any topic using manipulation, pressure, hidden propaganda to promote or refute, quote, hot topic. Another title, propaganda, agitation, manipulation, and persuasion. The faculty teaching this, some of the highest ranking hackers in Russian military intelligence, one exam session preparation letter from February 2024, signed by Viktor Netishko, a GRU general who commanded Fancy Bear. You'll all have heard of Fancy Bear because they're the guys that hacked into the DNC and John Podesta's emails in 2016 during the Russian interference campaign in our presidential election in 2016. He was indicted, this guy, by Bob Mueller in July of 2018 on charges of committing federal crimes intended to interfere with America's election. Now he's a university lecturer at the Russian MIT teaching the new generation. Another teacher, Yuri Shikolenko, senior GRU officer, sanctioned in the UK in July of 2025 for his role in multiple cyber attacks against Great Britain. The deputy head of Department 4, Kirill Stupakov, teaches espionage technology, counter-surveillance, instructs students on directional microphones, hidden cameras, the use of spotting scopes for long-distance surveillance. In 2022, he signed a 3-year contract with a GRU unit, meaning whilst he was on the faculty of the GRU Hogwarts, he was also engaged in active operations for the GRU. We looked at private telegram chats. Stupakov, this gets interesting too. He does not like Vladimir Putin. He calls him an old man. He calls former President Dmitry Medvedev an alcoholic. Fact, check, true. He refers to the chief of the general staff, Gerasimov, as a stupid, see you next Tuesday. I won't say the word. He predicts the war in Ukraine will end badly for us. Now, you have to understand, in Russia, it is a criminal offense to, quote, spread disinformation about the special military operation in Ukraine. By spreading disinformation, they mean telling the truth, or describing Russian military failures on the battlefield. So what do we have? We have a lieutenant colonel in the GRU who is also working for the GRU whilst teaching the next generation of GRU hackers, going online and under true name, defaming the president of Russia, other senior military officials, and basically committing treason, state treason, punishable at minimum by, I think, a 6-year prison term. But this is the guy who's essentially at the high-level faculty, the deputy head of Department 4. And the irony of this is the teaching materials he's giving to his students are to do what? The exact opposite of what he genuinely thinks. The special military operation is inevitable because Kyiv is run by nationalists and quote-unquote neo-Nazis. The circular in the university calls for striking our enemies as our fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers did. Again, this is Putin's notion of this is World War II revisited. So the damaging pipeline that connects directly to the most damaging cyber attacks in history, the worst one ever recorded, it was a NotPetya malware attack launched by GRU Unit 7455 in 2017, affected more than 160 countries, shut down the Danish shipping giant Maersk, shut down US pharmaceutical company Merck. It caused damage at nearly $1 billion. By the way, it also shut down hospitals in Pennsylvania, including emergency computer systems where patients going in for life-saving surgery, their entire charts were deleted. So they had to resort to physical charts. You've all seen the show The Pit. You know, in season 2, that episode with the cyber attack, thanks to our friends in the GRU. And this unit that I alluded to, 7455, it's called Sandworm. Sandworm's newest recruit, Alexei Kondrashov, graduated from Department 4 in 2024 with the rank of lieutenant. On his vKontakte page in Russian, he says, the end of the school year, let's burn the textbooks, right? So again, some of the most lethal malware GRU cyber operatives are now basically training up young kids on how to continue their fetid tradecraft. So in total, as of 2024, over 1,500 reservists, 429 prospective contract officers studying in Department 4, specializing in 14 military areas. These things are hiding in plain sight and nestled, embedded within an open, transparent university structure. So what does this all tell us? I know I've kind of gone on for a while here with these 4 case studies, but these are not isolated. These are facets of a single structural development. So the first element, as we mentioned, the privatization of state violence, Prigozhin model. Private wealth building a military capacity that serves one man while maintaining a legal distance from the state. Prigozhin was assassinated in Russia because he mounted an abortive coup or mutiny against Putin. His plane was blown up. So he might have died, but his legacy it survived him, and it's now been refined. Center 795, same logic as Wagner. Billionaire finances paramilitary structures, state provides cover and direction. When something goes wrong, billionaire has to absorb the costs, right? Doesn't come necessarily out of the state budget. And it doesn't matter because it's an oligarch who gets burned. Sergei Chemezov, probably the second most powerful man in Russia. He's the chief of Rostec. He co-sponsored Center 795. He's spent years cultivating a reputation for himself as a pragmatic moderate, someone the West can do business with. All of a sudden, he's tasked, because of the war, you have to pony up money and create Center 795. You have to engage in special operations, active measures, something he never wanted anything to do. After our investigation broke, nobody could find Sergei Chemezov for 3 days. His phones went dark, he disappeared as he was having kittens, because this is not the kind of profile he wants, right? And now he finds his name attached to a murder-for-hire plot targeting a very well-known Chechen dissident in Western Europe, and indeed unnamed victims or purported victims in New York City. The second element we can detect here is the weaponization of legitimate networks. So the new GRU sabotage operation, it doesn't build its own infrastructure. It simply co-ops or borrows somebody else's. Parcel bomb campaign that hit DHL and DPD ran entirely on a dormant network of Soviet Northern Fleet veterans, activated through a single favor between old friends and on the legitimate commercial logistics of Europe's own courier giants. No one in that chain had to be trained as an illegal, and it was run, the head of it was a cancer-stricken ex-sub-commander. Another guy was a horse breeder. There were 2 Ukrainian refugees, nephews to each other, a fraudster fresh off a pyramid scheme in Poland. 12 people, most with only fragmentary understanding of what they were doing, carrying, moving with live incendiary devices across 5 countries through NATO's internal borders at least 5 times. And again, the capacity for these things to go off and kill loads of people always existed. Network, though, was expendable, low cost, disposable by design. Doesn't work out, tear it up, start all over again. The courier infrastructure exploited wasn't the GRUs to build or maintain. The third element now is outsourcing of the information environment. 29155 did not hire journalists. It manufactured them. Our friend Dilana, the Bulgarian journalist, whether she fully understood her role or not, she became a distribution node for GRU-produced disinformation, publishing hack and leak materials as investigative reporting, creating a website that mimicked the aesthetic of the very outlet Bellingcat she was exposing her handlers. The falsehoods she published became official Russian government claims, again, Ukrainian biolabs tinkering with the weaponization of lethal pathogens, mouthed by the now former Director of National Intelligence of the United States. The loop was then complete. The fourth element, deinstitutionalization of recruitment. Department 4 at Bauman or Hogwarts, not an anomaly, it's a template. So the GRU has historically recruited from various sectors and backgrounds, usually membership roles of foreign communist parties or the Comintern during the Cold War, pre-Cold War in that case, Soviet period, the ranks of Soviet or Russian military. Now it bypasses these conventional structures for a more unconventional route, poaching from hackathons or setting up secret training grounds within Russia's technical institutes, using indicted election interference generals as the faculty. And the fifth and most important element of this is dysfunction. Now, you wouldn't think dysfunction should be a feature, not a bug, of Russian intelligence operations, right? The whole point is for them to function. But every one of these cases contains moments of extraordinary incompetence. The head of the GRU cyber unit finances his secret family using intelligence funds, names the shell company after a server his own operatives leave unprotected on the open internet. An FSB alpha veteran runs murder for hire through Google Translate. Department of Special Tasks recycles the same dozen operatives and the same chemical formula to use a parcel bomb. which makes it easier for them to be exposed, and so on and so forth. But the dysfunction is not a sign that Russian intelligence is weak. It's a sign that Russian intelligence is a crowded assembly line of interchangeable parts and can therefore indulge in sloppy tradecraft or lazy expediencies to produce a product for an audience of one. So units compete to impress Putin. Individual officers compete to impress their units. The incentive is to run the operation, show the activity, claim the success, not necessarily to run it well. The pressure to demonstrate results generates recklessness. Recklessness generates exposure. Exposure generates a demand for a new unit. So again, Center 795 does not exist anymore. It's been burnt to the ground. Other Center 795s will pop up. This creates a problem for the West. It makes us have to be more on guard. It makes us have to be more hypervigilant. It strains the resources of counterintelligence and law enforcement. And the logic here is similar to what the IRA said when they tried and failed to kill Margaret Thatcher in 1984. We only have to be lucky once. You have to be lucky all the time. And so Western governments now face a very uncomfortable implication. Burning one unit doesn't stop the mission. Whatever replaces, for instance, Center 795 is being planned already. A pipeline at Baumann producing new operatives who's going to staff it. The billionaires who financed these things will finance its successors. Or other billionaires will finance them, again, in competition and rivalry with Bokharev and Chemezov. So the question isn't whether the Russians are going to continue. They already are. It's whether we have the fortitude and the resiliency to keep pace with them. And one of the uncomfortable questions that's being raised across Europe now, because as you can see, the targets are in the main European, although, as I mentioned with the Chechen case, the United States is involved, is it time maybe to take the gloves off and stop being on the defensive and to go on the offensive? Do to the Russians what they do to us. Discombobulate them. Make life unpleasant. Send a message. I'll give you one example. I mentioned to you earlier that the GRU had recruited long-dormant organized crime networks in Estonia to smash the windows of cars of government ministers. And the Estonians are very conservative and reticent people. I should know, I spent a lot of time there. But they also understand the Russians very well because they were occupied for a long time. And this is their preternatural security threat. So one day, the GRU officer who commissioned this operation came down from his apartment in Moscow only to discover that his vehicle's windows had been smashed in by unknown assailants. So we're getting to the point, it's sort of like that movie, The Untouchables, Chicago Rules. They put one of yours in the hospital, you put one of theirs in the morgue. You have to play this game. Obviously, there's a chance of escalation, things going awry, operations waged by the West, should we engage in offensive campaigns like this, backfiring in spectacular fashion. And of course, in democracies, you screw up, it's a scandal. The party in charge gets ousted at the ballot box or people get fired. In Russia, as I've been saying, people don't pay a price for this. And all of the guys I've been talking about, the GRU officers who their pictures were taken, their biometrics are in the database of every Western country, they get sent to cushy little sinecures, administrative districts in Siberia. They join the presidential administration. They never have to worry about any money. They get, hero of the Russian Federation, pinned to their chest by Vladimir Putin himself. They're interchangeable too, they're expendable. So the question really becomes, every mistake that they make, all of their lapses in tradecraft, it's obvious they're not going to use Google Translate again, or maybe they will, but those will be the stupidest of the bunch. It's that they're just going to continue to mint more of this. And one of the leitmotifs of this, and I mention this every time I talk about malign activity by the Russians, if you want to understand what they're doing, if you want to understand why they're doing it, it really begins with Ukraine. And it begins with Ukraine long before the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Those ammunition and weapons depots in the Czech Republic that got blown up by the same people that poisoned Sergei Skripal. The first one they blew up was in 2011, 3 years before they went into Ukraine. That was at the height of the Obama-Putin reset. Remember that? That was an incendiary device implanted in a convoy of trucks with ammunition and weapons that bypassed, I think, 5 different capitals of NATO EU territory. So again, the potential for that thing to go off prematurely and kill thousands of people was great. Guess where the ammunition and the weapons were designed to go? To Emilian Gibrev, the Bulgarian arms dealer, who also got poisoned by the same people. And guess who he was going to then, as a state arms contractor, send all of that kit to? 3 entities. Number 1, Georgia, which in 2011 was just recovering from the 2008 summer war against Russia and trying to rearm. Syrian rebels fighting Bashar al-Assad's regime through a covert CIA program backed by Turkey and other Middle Eastern countries. and a country called Ukraine. So they've been planning this war. They've been planning this fight against the West for a very long time. And the real danger that we have, it's one thing if you're weak and you don't know how to fight back and you don't know how to defend yourself. We're getting there. We're learning. But the problem has been for so many years, we haven't even acknowledged that we're in a state of war with the adversary. And that has been the greatest virtue, the greatest asset that the Russians have. And it doesn't matter if it's the Keystone Cops, because again, they don't care about people, least of all their own. They just make more of these things. So on that note, I will gladly open things up to any questions you have. Yes, including about Lindsey Graham and his supposed heart attack, which I've been asked about all week. But I want to thank you all for coming and listening. I know this went very long, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much to Michael for his all of his information, all of this insider knowledge, if you will. And so we're going to start with question and answer period. We have till 8:30. A couple ground rules. If you can raise your hand, the interns will come around to you and give you a microphone, but keep your hand raised so they can see you. Also, if you're up for it, please stand up and introduce yourself. And then finally, please ask a question and not make a commentary. But we're going to start our question and answer period with our intern, Floyd, who's going to ask the first question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Floyd. My question is, what do you expect the effects on U.S. foreign policy to be as a result of Russian espionage?
Well, I mean, there are plenty of people in the U.S. intelligence community who are under no illusions about what the Russians are doing. One of the things that I've been working on for a while, didn't include in this presentation, is an investigation into so-called Havana syndrome, or what's known as anomalous health incidents. So basically, I think I will now say with a high degree of confidence that it is very much the case the Russians for many years have been going around using a pulse microwave weapon to maim and inflict grievous harm on America's spies, defense officials, diplomats all over the world, including some who I've gotten to know quite well, who were at very, very high levels of the CIA, doing things to countermand the Russian threat. Many of them, by the way, had served in a foreign station in Europe known as Kyiv in 2014, 2015. So you notice like what the Ukrainians are able to do now, long-range drone strikes, blowing up Russian generals in Moscow with scooter bombs, unleashing drones in hidden compartments from trucks that take out strategic bombers on tarmacs thousands of miles apart. A lot of this intelligence capability was built by us after 2014, after the Euromaidan revolution and after Yanukovych fled to Russia and the Russians subsequently invaded. And the Russians, I mean, again, the Rosetta Stone for understanding this is Ukraine. The Russians were always preparing to go to war. They wanted to take as many pieces off the chessboard as possible of people who had the know-how and the willingness and the competence to countermand their activities and to help the Ukrainians resist. And they've been targeting Americans, right, for many, many years. CIA doesn't acknowledge Havana syndrome is real. One of the problems is, well, if we say this is happening, it's an act of war, and that demands a reciprocal response. And now we get into difficult questions about escalation with a nuclear power, which threatens to annihilate us with nuclear weapons on an hourly basis, right? Another thing is, well, they've been hurting Americans. We didn't do anything about it. We couldn't protect our people in the field. I think what's happened now, and I mean, I say this having reported extensively, including in the current administration, what's happened now is people understand it's not going to stop with Ukraine. It starts with Ukraine. You know, everywhere you go in Europe, you talk to people who are like, the Russians are going to rebuild their army. By 2030, they'll start to probe and test NATO. I mean, right now I've been having frantic phone calls with the Estonians and the Swedes and the Poles because the Poles announced that U.S. intelligence had passed to them information suggesting the Russians were going to do something a little bit beyond hybrid, a little bit beyond a drone swarm or sabotage operation, something conventional. So the threat is very real. How it affects U.S. foreign policy, I mean, I would liken the American government in this regard. It's sort of like a giant tanker in the middle of a body of water, a very relevant metaphor for the current state of the world. if it has to change course in a dramatic fashion, 180 degrees, it doesn't whip right around. It moves slowly by degrees, right? And so some of the conversations that I'm having now, some of the questions being asked, and some of the debates being had were unfathomable even a few years ago, including, is it time perhaps to take the gloves off? So just to end on this note, every time a Ukrainian drone or missile strikes at energy infrastructure in Russia, or takes out an oil refinery or a terminal, I mean, this is causing catastrophic damage to the Russian economy, which in turn will have an effect on the war, and already has. Who do you think provides the targeting data for those targets? The CIA. And this is happening under the Trump administration with a president who is by no means pro-Ukraine and will take every opportunity he gets to punch the president of that country in the face. Why are they doing this? Well, they understand this is a long-term strategic threat. The Russians pose a clear and present danger to the United States and certainly to our allies. And also the Ukrainians have the capacity to project power that was unthinkable, right? They're not losing now, they're winning. And I think America, and certainly the guy who runs our country, he likes winners. So this is changing U.S. foreign policy. There are bolder decisions being taken. You just don't read about them necessarily on the front page of the New York Times. Sure.
Yeah, if you can wait for the mic, we're recording this, so just wait for the mic and keep your hand up. Thank you.
Michael, you've made it clear that Russia is playing the long game. How are we playing the long game? What is our equivalent of their perception of this being a long struggle? Where are we in relation to that, especially given that so many of the career people have been let go?
Yeah, no, I mean, the USIC, everything notwithstanding everything I just said in the prior answer, has been hollowed out, and a lot of good people, veterans who understand Russia and who spent their lives combating Russia have either retired or been fired. Look, we have elections every 4 years. We change administrations, we change presidents. Every president comes into office thinking that he is going to be the person to reset relations with Russia. We had the reset with Obama. Even George W. Bush famously, he looked into Putin's soul, his eyes, and saw his soul. Remember that? And that was a little bit before they invaded Georgia. Joe Biden, who didn't anticipate the Ukraine war, but basically told everybody it was coming. He wanted, quote, stable and reliable relations with Russia. And then, of course, Donald Trump would love nothing better than to make nice with Putin. He's desperate for rapprochement. The problem is the Russians are not willing to meet him on the ground that he requires. The Russians don't think like this, right? They don't have to answer to an electorate. I mean, there are power verticals. There's an old saying, the Kremlin has many towers. So there are competitive rival. I mean, I've just given a whole presentation on the different factions and business interests. But at the end of the day, Putin decides the course of the country and the fate of the country. If he decides that he wants to take the gloves off against the West, which he's already done, he's going to do it. Nothing will stop him. The services will be activated. People will have their marching orders. Here, it's different. We have bureaucracies. We have congressional oversight. Covert action is not a very popular thing in this country for historical reasons. So are we playing a long game? No. And I think only recently have at least some elements in the U.S. government even recognized there is a game to be played, right? For so many years, it was like, we just have a transactional relationship with the Russians. It's true, they're not an empire. Their greatest asset is nuclear weapons, and basically their propaganda built up over many, many decades, which we have assimilated into our thinking about how invincible they are. So I tell the Ukrainians, one thing that you do very well, apart from chopping them down physically, is you also chop down these narratives, right? How many times have the Russians said, we're going to use nuclear weapons if you bomb Crimea? Crimea was bombed last night. They're not nuking anybody, right? So I think as we begin to recognize that, they can take it on the chin a little bit, We can escalate, and they'll scream and shout, and Medvedev will go on drunken tirades on Twitter and all of that. But there's also, we are desensitized to a lot of this stuff now because they've been saying it. They've been playing these cards for so long. So maybe that's a good thing. Europeans, I have to say, I've been shocked that anything approaching a pro-Ukraine coalition is held together this well for this long. And the Russians were capitalizing, banking on the fact that it would fall apart, because they spent 20 years bribing, extorting, buying their way, building pipelines, integrating their energy infrastructure with the West, and they just thought, oh, at some point everyone's going to get tired and give up. We may yet get there, but right now we haven't. And again, the Ukrainians have now changed the nature of this conflict from, please help us, we're fighting for our survival, our existence is at stake too. Actually, you guys need us. You went to war in Iran and you were shooting $3 million Patriot PAC-3 interceptors at $30,000 Iranian drones. We have $2,500 counter drones that take out Shahids. So it took the killing of 6 US servicemen in Kuwait and the destruction of American AWACS aircraft in Saudi Arabia for the US to quietly, discreetly invite the Ukrainians in, and they installed their SkyMap integrated air defense system using acoustic technology and artificial intelligence. And now guess what? They're signing security and defense agreements with every Arab country and Turkey and with us, because suddenly they have become the center of gravity for military technological innovation in Europe. So that's another thing that they have done very well. Show us that, oh no, you can fight back and you can actually win, even with, in their case, they don't have the manpower, so they make up for it with robotics. Whether or not this holds, I don't know. I don't make predictions, but so far it's people are beginning to learn the right lessons, I think. Sure.
How would you categorize the potential...
Oh, yeah, sorry. By the way, am I supposed to call on people, or do you want to? Okay, you two all on. Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you. What's your assessment of the NATO commitment to the Baltics, particularly in light of the operations that you were describing and how easy it is for them to embed, with so many ethnic Russians on the ground there?
So it's a very good question, and it's one that comes up a lot. Of course, the Baltics, particularly the Estonians, don't like it when we talk about Article 5 being a dead letter, or that the U.S. won't come to the aid of NATO if NATO is tested, and even under Donald Trump, because for them this is the whole ball game, right? Ethnic Russians in Estonia, not as big of a problem as you'd think. Polling suggests they'd much rather live in Estonia and be citizens of the European Union than cross the river. Even the ones in Narva, because they see the quality of life in Russia. I don't know. One of the things that the Russians are kind of toying around with is, okay, if we do X and they don't do Y, if they don't respond, that's an invitation for us to do Z, right? We played this game with them too, right? They would threaten, oh, it'll be nuclear holocaust, World War III, we'll attack NATO, we'll attack the United States if you give HIMARS or ATACMS to the Ukrainians. We do it, and then they kind of sheepishly, back down, and then they start making new threats about giving them F-16s or Abrams tanks. So, this is the duality to this. My own view is I don't think the Russians have the capacity to fight a war with NATO right now, because if they tried, even if the United States wasn't party to it, the combined armies of Poland, Sweden, Finland, all 3 Baltic states, Germany, they don't have the manpower, but they're certainly producing the kit. And also, by the way, Ukraine. People forget, Ukraine can fight the Russians on their own turf, but they're also fighting the Russians everywhere else. They've contributed drones to rebels in Mali. They had a small part in the Syrian offensive, which toppled Bashar al-Assad a year ago. They've eaten the Russians' lunch in the Central African Republic and elsewhere. Again, the ability to project power. In a way, they're already part of NATO, and if NATO were attacked or tested in this way, they would volunteer, they would line up. How can we help, right? To show that, they're the most battle-tested, combat-ready army in Europe by orders of magnitude. So, look, again, I try not to make predictions. Do I think the Russians want to experiment with this? There might be a faction. Again, you have ultranationalists, you have the so-called Siloviki, you have crazy people. Konstantin Malofeev, who's known as the Orthodox oligarch, who envisages scenarios. The best-case scenario by 2030, by his think tank's lights, is the use of a nuclear weapon in the West. That doesn't mean the Russians are going to do it, but this is one of the arguments that's being put forward. But no, I think their hands are pretty tied in one battlefield already. I can't see, oh, I'm not calling on people again, I forgot. I forgot my own rules.
You're certainly an articulate explainer of the Russian malware and what they're doing. And several times tonight you've said your organization has uncovered this, that, and the other thing about how they're doing things. So my question is, why are you still alive?
It's a menacing question, I have to say. Don't see me afterwards, whoever you are. Well, look, I am one of 3 editors at The Insider who's not on the kill list. A couple years ago, the UK rounded up a network of Bulgarian spies who were tasked with, among other things, trying to either kidnap or murder the editor-in-chief of The Insider, Roman Dobrokhotov, who's Russian, living in the West, and my other colleague, Christo Grozev, who you probably know if you've seen the Navalny documentary. They were arrested, they were tried, they were convicted, they were sentenced. They spent half their time in jail already, and the UK just let them out without telling their targets that they'd been let out. Look, since 2014, Fancy Bear, GRU cyber operators have been trying to hack my emails. I've been given indications lately that they're looking my name up, they're looking up my wife's biographical data. My own view of this is, again, Havana Syndrome and AHI, they're targeting American spies and people who are in a military capacity, at least the way they see it. As a journalist, an American journalist, I mean, they want to screw around with me. They want to harass me. They want to make life unpleasant. They want to get into my computer systems and exfiltrate data, either to embarrass me or probably more relevantly to see who I'm talking to. Because we do. We have sources that leak stuff to us. But Christo and Roman, Christo is Bulgarian and Roman is Russian. For a Russian to be doing the kind of work that he is doing, he will be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life because they see him as a traitor. And I don't have to tell you how Putin handles traitors. So that's the answer to your question. Now that said, you know, all of us live in the West, and we are known to law enforcement, and we have the states that we live in trying to protect us as best they can. But again, as I said, you know, you have to be lucky all the time. We only have to be lucky once, kind of thing. So it's a risk.
Michael, thanks a lot for coming. Could you, besides shadow fleets, do any of these units generate hard currency for Russia? And what are some of, if so, what are some of the more creative or unusual ways you've seen them generate hard currency?
Yeah, I mean, you know, cut out companies and organizations. It's funny, there was a GRU director in the 1920s, Jan Bursin, who's one of the most legendary spy masters in Russian Soviet history. And he came up with a very clever thing to do. This is at a time when the Soviet Union was not diplomatically or just recognized in various European countries, and including, by the way, in the United States. So in lieu of having embassies and consulates where you can embed spies, residenturas, and so on, create fake companies or carve-outs that you can use to basically launder your operations. So some of these things end up being successful, and you can remunerate yourself. You can generate operational resources from your side businesses. I haven't seen anything in terms of like cryptocurrency. They use cryptocurrency to compensate agents in the field. But obviously, look, if you just reverse engineer some of the stuff I've been talking about, oligarchs made billions of dollars, you know, selling oil, selling natural resources in Russia, but also investing heavily in banks, buying up assets, concerns all over the West. I mentioned football clubs, newspapers, you know, telecom companies, whatever. That money is now going to finance these operations, right? So you're not necessarily having to dip into state coffers. You just have to tap the wealthiest people in Russia. It's like, okay, now your patriotic duty is to kick in to the kitty. So they could see that as a net gain for themselves.
I'm just wondering about how you would categorize the kinds of countermeasures the West can take, not to the Ukraine sort of full war situation, but to the kinds of activities you were describing in your 4 case studies. Because as you said, you know, if Putin gets away with X, he'll do Y and Z.
Right.
How do you sort of counter that without it escalating to a degree?
No, I mean, it's an excellent question. You know, the biggest liability we have is also one of our greatest virtues, or at least, you know, was up until recently. I mean, we're open societies. We welcome people in from other parts of the world. We don't read each other's mail. We don't, you know, we don't inhabit an authoritarian culture. So the Russians see that as something to be exploited. Freedom of speech. This comes up all the time, right? You deal in disinformation and influence operations. I mean, there are Americans that I know are on Russian payroll. I know that also three-letter agencies are aware that they're on the Russian payroll. Why aren't you indicting them? Well, you know, they're taking money from a foreign actor. The worst that they could do is register for FAIR. I say, yeah, but if the foreign actor is a spy, you can go after the spy, and you can. So another consideration is, well, this is a freedom of speech issue. You know, so there are people. There was an operation to recruit a bunch of MAGA podcasters several years ago. Tenet Media, you may have heard of it. So what did the DOJ do? It indicted the Russian intelligence officers running the thing, but it kept the names of the Americans. You know, subject one or whatever they do in the indictment. Everyone figured out who it was, though. But these podcasters, I mean, they have not suffered. One of them has accreditation at the White House now, when other normal news organizations cannot get it. So the stigma that attaches to being either a witting or an unwitting agent of influence for the Russian government, or any other government for that matter, has somehow evaporated. Everything is kind of like slopaganda, as they say online. Everybody's doing a grift, and there's no such thing as truth, there's no such thing as fact, everybody's on someone's payroll, and so that has demoralized our society to such a degree that the Russians kind of go like, you know, they don't have to worry about those countermeasures. Now at the military level, the intelligence level, spies are coming in all the time. You still have a very robust mission in New York, where I live, attached to the UN. And a complex in Riverdale, the Bronx, which the Russians have used for decades to do signals intelligence, collect on, you know, the FBI and so on and so forth. A lot of that hasn't changed, even though we expelled a lot of them because of the war in Ukraine, and before that because of the assassination attempt on Skripal. But no, I mean, there are all kinds of ways for them to get around this. There's no perfect answer to this. The best you can do, you know, don't have a Gmail password that's, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, don't leave things lying out in the open. But one of the scariest things I ever heard from a white hat hacker that was recruited by the Estonians, I said to him, you know, is there anything you can do to completely prevent yourself, to be invincible? And before I could even finish the question, he was just like, no. He's like, if they want you and they can spend the money, they'll get you.
Michael, thank you for coming tonight and your comments.
Sure.
Given the professed eternal friendship between China and Russia, what degree of collaboration and cooperation are you seeing between the GRU and their Chinese counterparts?
I'm so glad you asked me that question. So this past week, we dropped another investigation we've been working on for several months, also with Der Spiegel and Le Monde, which disclosed that as recently as 2023, the Russians and the Chinese have an annual conference that nobody really knows about, where they meet and they talk about military collaboration and integrated air defenses. I mean, they're talking about things that were unprecedented in the history of the Sino-Russian relationship, shooting down missiles together and so on. But the most interesting thing that they disclosed, and we have the slideshow that they produced on this, they see as one of the biggest threats now because of the war in Ukraine, and also elsewhere against Iran and in the Persian Gulf, Starlink. It's Elon Musk, SpaceX, you know, the satellite internet constellation in low Earth orbit. So Chinese aerospace specialists put together a presentation, and this is an interesting dynamic here because usually it's the Russians going to the Chinese, help us, right? So the Chinese are now training Russian soldiers to fight in Ukraine. Reuters reported on that, and it's been confirmed by U.S. intelligence. This was the Chinese going to the Russians saying, we want you to help us. So we have a 3-tiered plan for dealing with Starlink. Number one, let's tie up SpaceX in international courts, sue them for being basically polluting space. It's too congested, we can't get our satellites up there. Number two, electronic jamming, cyber warfare, disable the satellites, you know, remotely. Number three, let's just shoot things down. Missiles with cluster warheads, ball bearings, or you know, little pellets that can shred satellites, or I think they're called little vehicles that release tiny satellites that can literally ram into and collide with anything floating in space. So we called up SpaceX, because Elon is a big fan of China. He's kind of pro-China, as he described in 2023. His biggest Tesla factory is in Shanghai. Very good relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. Answer came there none. And what are you going to do? Now the Chinese want to take down your babies in space. So they're absolutely collaborating. And one of the issues for the Russians is they have so mortgaged their country to China that should this relationship dissolve at some point, a partnership without limits, they call it. It's not quite. The Chinese still spy on the Russians and the Russians still spy on the Chinese. Should this dissolve, they're in a very difficult spot because China could do all sorts of provocative things in the Far East. That was one of the big strategic considerations that Moscow had up until, well, they probably still do have it. So yes, they are absolutely working together and absolutely declaring common cause against the West, and particularly the United States and our military industrial complex.
Hey, what's up, Michael? I'm next. I'm standing behind a camera over here.
Oh, okay.
My name's Chad Rich. Thanks for coming tonight. This is wildly interesting. I don't know if you've had a chance to pick up our local paper, but if you go to the classifieds, there might be a job that says, lawn maintenance must know how to start a lawnmower, or accountant must know QuickBooks, or ski instructor must know how to ski. What was the job advertisement like when you went looking for a job? Looking for a writer who knows about the Russian underbelly? Or how did you stumble in or purposely get into this line of work?
Well, the first thing I kind of cut my teeth in journalism was the Middle East. So I did a lot of work on the Syrian revolution, then civil war, and then jihadist insurgency. So the first book I wrote was on ISIS. And what I noticed, I'd always been interested in Russian history, Soviet history, Russian literature, read it in college, and then got really interested in it after college. But when it was 2015 when the Russians intervened in Syria, I was doing a lot of work on war crimes committed by Bashar al-Assad and assorted militias, Hezbollah, the IRGC. And when the Russians went in and I started reporting on their stuff, it was like this white dwarf moment of attacks online. Their state media was going after me, their RT, with the English language. They had a guy, an Irishman, who I think his beat was me, because like every week he was writing about, perfidious Michael Weiss does this. So I kind of got interested. I was a victim of information operations, disinformation, and in 2014 I published, that was a year before, sort of a think tank report, really a small book called The Menace of Unreality, trying to understand how Russian active measures like this work. And again, we were focused squarely on what they had done in Ukraine, without any understanding or sort of prescience about the fact that this was going to be exported soon to a theater near you. American election interference, sabotage operations in Europe, and so on. So I don't know, the origin story here is not as interesting or sexy as you might think. I became a target, and I was fascinated by what I was going through, and then I started to research the GRU after 2016, because I noticed a lot of people would get up on TV and be like, oh, it's the same thing as the KGB. I'm like, no, it's not. And so I realized nobody has actually written a definitive history of the GRU. There have been books about the early years from 1918 until the 30s. There have been defector memoirs. There's been sort of case studies. So now my second book is this big history of the GRU. And in the course of that, I met Christo Grozev, probably the only genius I've ever gotten to know, much less become a friend, because we traveled together to Bulgaria in 2018 to interview Emilian Gibrev, the arms dealer who was poisoned by Unit 29155. So we interviewed him together, and I said, this is amazing stuff that you're doing. I said, but it's so dense and data-driven, you need somebody to kind of turn it into narrative journalism. So a few years later, we decided, let's all work together, and then I joined the Insider, and to try and make these stories read like, basically our goal is nonfiction le carré, right? Spy yarns that happen to be true, and oh, by the way, we have the receipts for them, so.
Michael, now that the people in Moscow are beginning to get a taste of their own medicine,
Yeah.
How does that cognitive dissonance with the stories they've been told over the last 4 years work? How do they experience that?
So in 2023, I think, Prigozhin launches his March on Moscow, his attempted coup using Wagner fighters. And it's really amazing how far these guys got. They literally occupied the headquarters of a military district in Rostov, and it took the deputy director of the GRU to parley with Prigozhin, stand down. But they probably could have made it all the way to Moscow. So at the Insider, we said to do a post-mortem on this, and we queried sources that we have in the GRU and the FSB and the Interior Ministry, basically the security structures. And we said, well, what did you think about this? And there were two prevailing sentiments. Number one, we don't care. This asshole, that asshole, what's the difference? We're still going to steal money and get drunk, and we'll do what we have to do, but our heart's not in it anymore. Oh, okay, interesting. Number two, right on. We want Prigozhin to take over the country because Putin has destroyed everything. This war has been waged absolutely ridiculously. We're losing. It shouldn't have been waged in the first place. I mean, just really, like I alluded to this guy who teaches at Bauman University. I mean, treasonous sentiment within the security structures. So now the question is, and everybody kind of gets ahead of themselves. I happen to think the regime is pretty stolid, and I don't think Putin's hold on power is going to disintegrate in the immediate future. But this is something that everyone's talking about, because now you're beginning to see interesting things happen. There's an intelligence journal founded by two. One is a former KGB/SVR, that's the Foreign Intelligence Service officer, who happens to be one of Putin's mentors, who was deputy defense minister in the early aughts. He was in charge of military procurement and exports. He's kind of like a veteran, grizzled guy. Another guy who is the head of the GRU analytic department. And they put out this intelligence journal. And a few weeks ago, they published an essay quoting what Putin was saying at the Valdai Security Forum in 2025, where Putin just completely disconnected from the reality of modern warfare. He's talking about drones, he's talking about artillery and armor, but it bears no resemblance to what was happening at the time. And it was the snarkiest, most withering criticism of him. And the one rule was, you can go after anybody. You can go after Gerasimov, chief of the staff, general staff. You can go after Shoigu, the defense minister. You can go after military commanders. You can go after the heads of the security services. But you never, ever, ever criticize Putin personally. Now they're beginning to do that. So you don't know. I mean, and as you know, cataclysmic change happens in Russia usually when they lose a war. I mean, one notable exception is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Actually, no, that's not an exception. They lost in Afghanistan, and that precipitated it. So if they lose in Ukraine, there's a very good chance that there could be something interesting happen in Moscow. But of course, here's where the West starts to get very nervous and says, well, that's what we're afraid of. What if it devolves into civil war and you have warlords running around with nuclear weapons? Not a legitimate concern to have, but it becomes very dangerous when they start to sort of extrapolate from that concern. Maybe it's time to turn off the spigot or to stop helping the Ukrainians, right? I think that Russia can survive. I think Putin can survive, personally, strategic defeat in Ukraine. If the Ukrainians retake Crimea, or what they're doing now, completely isolated with their mid-range drone strikes, I mean, the queues for gasoline in Moscow are a mile long now. He can declare victory and go home at any time, change the channel. And the population would breathe a sigh of relief. Upwards of 80% of Russians would like the war to end tomorrow, obviously on Russian terms, but even if they're not Russian terms, that can be rejiggered, because reality is what they perceive it to be based on what the state tells them. So, things can get very provocative very quickly.
Okay, and on that note, we are done for the night. Thank you to Michael so much. Come next week at 7 o'clock. We have Stephen Morrison coming to talk about global health. Pick up a program on your way out and look at the QR code in the back to donate. Thanks so much.